So, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is David Solomon, and I have the privilege of being the CEO of the Australian Friends of Tel Aviv University, or AFTAL, just one of the 26 Friends associations around the world supporting the university in its work. October the 7th seems like an eternity ago, but it's only 68 days. As the enormity and horror of the Hamas massacres was revealed throughout October and November, in the tidal wave of public opinion, the rhetoric of pro-Palestinian protests shifted the celebrations of resistance to accusations that Israel was committing genocide, and then demands for a ceasefire, which would allow Hamas to reorganize and rearm. And denial that Hamas had carried out any atrocities or even an attack have also become more common. The silence from feminist organizations on and off campus regarding the use of rape as a weapon by Hamas and the Gazans has been especially shocking. And it's with this background that we've asked Ambassador Aharoni to be with us tonight to discuss Israel's public image, where to now, and probably a whole lot more. Public speaker, author, lecturer, writer, advisor, and diplomat. These are just some of the ways to describe Ambassador Ido Aharoni. A 25-year veteran of Israel's Foreign Service, Ambassador Aharoni is a public diplomacy specialist, advisor to international companies and organizations, founder of the Brand Israel program, a member of the Board of Governors at Tel Aviv University, and a visiting lecturer at TAU's Koller School of Management. He's also the host of TAU Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Ambassador Aharoni started off studying film and television, sociology and anthropology at TAU before doing a master's degree in mass communications and other qualifications in government and diplomacy. And there are three highlights I pulled out of his career that I'd like to share with you. As part of a stellar diplomatic career, he was Israel's longest serving consul general in New York and the tri-state area, which is Israel's largest diplomatic mission worldwide. He's a global distinguished professor of international relations at New York University's Graduate School of Arts and Science. And he also served under the then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and took part in the back-channel negotiations that led to the signing of the Oslo Accords. As I say, those were just three of the highlights that jumped out at me. Ido, it's such a pleasure to have you here today, although I do wish it were for very different reasons.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and thank you so much for putting together such an esteemed group of people to hear what I have to say. So what I would like to do is just start with a little overview of the observations that I've made especially since I came back from a month-long tour of the United States, where I spent time with communities in 8 different cities. I held over 40 public events and tens of meetings and media engagements. And so I have a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the field. So when we're talking about Israel's public image, and you have to understand that this is in many ways, October 7th is the 9/11 moment of the Israelis. And I must say that in parts of the United States that I've been to, and from my conversations with my Canadian friends and now with my Australian friends, and certainly with my South African friends, my sense is that the Western world, people that care about Western values, they experience 10/7 in a very similar way the world experienced 9/11. And you see that also in public opinion surveys. So, for example, contrary to what most Israelis feel, actually the level of political support in the world, especially in the United States, has gone up. The level of political support for Israel's actions in Gaza, the legitimacy of Israel's military attempt to take out Hamas, are actually supported in a very big way in most of the Western world. And there are exceptions, and we'll talk about that. But if the one thing I learned since 9/11 until today, when I look at the positioning of Israel in the world, because we're talking about Israel's image today, And we have to make a distinction between two things that I learned early on. There's a big difference between what people think about what you do and how people feel about you. What people think about what you do can change. What people feel about you is very difficult to change. What people feel about you is a much better predictor, because it's all about curiosity and perception of knowledge. So if you consider Israel a brand, if you consider Tel Aviv University a brand, if you consider Apple a brand, if you consider Amazon a brand, there are four pillars that you have to consider that exist for every brand. And these are measurable pillars. The first is what we call differentiation. To what extent can we distinguish the brand from its competition? Usually countries fare very high on differentiation. The second is knowledge, what people know about the brand. Now, we don't really know what people know. What we can find out is what people think they know. We call it perception of knowledge because there's no way for us to really go into every person's head and to find out what is it exactly that they know about Israel. What we can do is ask them if they'd like to know more. If they would like to know more, it means that they're curious about the brand. If they're curious about the brand, there's a future for the relationship. If they say, no, I don't want to know more, I feel I know everything, I already know everything I need to know, then it means that there's no curiosity to learn more about the brand. And that means that the brand is actually in deep trouble. So we're not measuring real knowledge, we're measuring perception of knowledge. What do you think you know? And then comes esteem, how highly regarded the brand is. So whatever it is that you know about Australia, how highly regarded Australia is in your eyes. And lastly is relevant, how relevant the brand is to your life. So of course, if you're a religious Jew, Israel is very relevant to your life. If you're a devout Christian, Israel is very relevant to your life. But if you are unrelated totally to that world of religion or Zionism or history or archaeology or whatever it is, Israel has to work harder to make itself relevant to you. So you need to find other angles. So for example, about 20 years ago, we discovered that Israel could be relevant to people that are identify as gay, or people that just simply love music, or people that love good food, especially Mediterranean food, and so on and so forth. So what we did, we ran a test. This is right after 9/11. This is what we discovered in the United States. Then we went on to validate the findings all over the world. And I'm sorry to say that we did not include Australia in that study, but we went to 22 countries. And this is what we discovered. So Israel scored very high on differentiation, pretty high on knowledge, on perception knowledge, and low on esteem, and even lower on relevance. This is what the Americans were telling us right after 9/11, and it wasn't that different from what the rest of the Western world was telling us about Israel. Yes, I know who you are. I can distinguish you from your neighbors. Uh, I don't want to know more about you. What I do know, I do not hold in high esteem, and I don't see how you're relevant to my life. And when we looked into this and we said, how did we end up here? We discovered that the main reason for that really horrendous results because you have to understand what those results showed is that the Americans were not curious about us. And they felt that they knew who we were. They had the wrong kind of knowledge about us. They knew that we were engaged in conflict, but we were distant. They said, yes, I know who you are, but you're not for me. Now, that's not a good thing for a brand to be distant. Yes, I know who you are, but I know North Korea, but North Korea is not for me. I'm certainly not going to visit there. And so we wanted to know what's the reason, and we discovered that the reason is that Israel was solely identified by its conflict. So we took the one problem that we had and we turned it into the one thing that defines who we are to the world. That was our own doing. Now, who did it? the political leadership, of course, the Israeli political leadership over the years. And the reason why they did it is because, first of all, they served them domestically. That's how they built power and relevance domestically, talking about the conflict constantly. And then, of course, talking about the conflict with the world. When you look at the speeches made by Israeli leaders in the United Nations, by speeches made by Israeli leaders in the media, from Ben Gurion all the way to Netanyahu, it's the same thing. They constantly talk about Israel's problems. There were some exceptions. Shimon Peres spoke about the future a lot, but he was ridiculed in Israel as a daydreamer, and others. And so we decided that the conceptual solution would be to broaden the conversation about Israel. Now, in terms of numbers, this is what we discovered, and this is where it becomes very relevant to what is happening today. So we discovered that the 10-20-70 rules apply in the Western world. What is the 10-20-70 rule? The 10 stand for the 10% that never buy whatever it is that we're trying to sell them. We call them the intellectual elite. These are mostly members of the academia, people that are able to rationalize everything, including queers for Palestine, things like that. I must say that our research shows that even among those 10%, the number of people that thought that Israel has no right to exist, this is, I'm talking about last time we did that was 2014. The people that thought that Israel has no right to exist among the 10% was a minority. Okay, but the 10% not buying anything Israel is trying to sell, I call them the Noam Chomskys of the world. Then you have the 20%. 20% represent the people that report a deep emotional connection to Israel. Can tell you that it's a huge number. Usually people don't feel a strong emotional connection to other countries. What does it mean? It means that at least in the United States, when something happens to Israel, for the 20%, it's as if it happened to them. That's how strongly they're connected to Israel. Who are they? Of course, Jews that support Israel, Zionists, but mostly Christians that love Israel. And they love Israel because of their theology. They're not interested in the politics of Israel, unlike what most Israelis think. But then you have the 70%. Now, the 20%, they are the opposite of the 10%, right? They buy everything that we sell. They love us. Then you have the 70%. The 70% are uninterested, uninformed. The Middle East is not part of it's not on their list of their things. I remember we ran a study in Canada for the Hebrew U. At the time, I'm talking about after 9/11, we asked the Canadians, what are the most important things that you care about? And 69, and it was interesting that the Jews were always 4 percentage points above the average. So if 65% of the people said health, then 69% of the Jews said health. If 3% of the people said the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, then 7% of the Jews said that. So it was always 4% above the average. But the situation in the Middle East ranked last in the list of concerns for the Canadian people right after the invasion of America to Iraq and Afghanistan in March of 2003. Last, dead last. And you had like 15 different topics before that. So they really didn't care about their own countries engaged in the Middle East, let alone Israel. So what was the strategy? The strategy was, which people refer to as brand Israel. The strategy was to build Israel's reputation among the 70%, because we concluded that the 10% represent the lost case. There's nothing you can do or say to change their mind. And therefore, what we can do is build Israel's brand. Now, in terms of, to use medical terms, we were trying to give them some immune system against the poisonous messages and the toxic messages of the 10%. So that was the idea. So when the crisis happens, And someone, God forbid, will say, and this was before people interjected words like apartheid and genocide into the conversation. But the idea back then was, let's give them the tools to get to know us so that they will know that Israel is not apartheid. So when someone says apartheid, they'll be in a position to say, you can't tell me that Israel is apartheid. I know Israel. Israel is not apartheid. Let me give an example of how it worked. So I become consul general in August of 2010, and immediately shortly thereafter, I'm being approached by a fellow by the name of Michael Miller from New York, who was at the time the head of the JCRC of New York. The JCRC is the political arm of the Jewish Federation. And he says to me, listen, there's a bright young star in New York politics. He was just elected to the New York City Council, and he happens to be Black and Latino and gay. And he's only 28. And I think we should take him to Israel. I'd like you to host him for lunch. And then after that, we'll take him to Israel and let's discuss the schedule. And so I hosted him for lunch. He was a lovely young man, came to my apartment and with Michael Miller. And then he went to Israel. And I remember that Michael Miller arranged for him a lot of free time to get to know the Israelis in a unmediated, uncensored, authentic fashion. 15 years later, or 14 years later, Representative Richie Torres is the #1 advocate for Israel in Congress today. And I urge all of you to go and listen, go on YouTube and listen to what Richie Torres has to say about Israel. Because when he speaks about Israel, when he says there's no apartheid in Israel, where Israel is not performing genocide in Gaza, and he speaks from a position of knowledge because he was given that immune system. He came to Israel. He visited Israel. So that was our plan. We called it Brand Israel. Unfortunately, the Israeli government, I presented this plan to Prime Minister Netanyahu in August of 2010. And the plan included heavy and massive investment in influencers like Richie Torres from all over the world. We're talking about 1,500 influencers per year coming to visit Israel. We talked about academic exchange of bringing all the PhD candidates from all the humanities departments in the world to visit Israel. We talked about 5,000 of them. Imagine if we had done that back in 2010. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu completely rejected everything I said. And the plan was never implemented. But many other people believed in it in the Jewish world. And this was all the Israeli government said no, because it cost money and they needed money for other things. But other Jewish...
I can share with you that in Australia, there are several organizations, Jewish organizations, that have done exactly what you're talking about with teachers, with politicians, with business leaders, and the results have been exactly as you've suggested happened, where people visit Israel, learn the truth for themselves, and come back with an understanding that the rhetoric we hear is actually very prejudiced and very biased at the very minimum. So it's definitely a successful strategy.
Yeah, and I can only thank you for that. I can only thank you for that because that's really what needs to be done. And the more the merrier. So what happens now is this. We are experiencing the perfect storm. We didn't do all the things that we should have done. Okay, there's nothing we can do about that. We are facing the worst reputational crisis in Israel's history since 1948. And this is not the time to build the relationship with the 70%. This is the time to engage the 10%. And the way I say to engage them is not to try to convert their opinion. That's not the goal. The goal is to punish them. Is to punish them for their blatant anti-Semitism. Is to punish them for not standing for the side of humanity, during this crisis. And this is the only framing that we need to look at 10-7. It's humanity versus the rest. It's the West versus the rest. This is not about Israel and Palestine. This is not about free Palestine. If anything, it's about free Palestine of Hamas, but it's not about free Palestine. This is not about the Palestinian national aspirations. How do we know that? Several indications. The first is Hamas charter by itself. Hamas is not concerned least with Palestinian nationalism. They're not concerned with Palestinian well-being. Even now, all the humanitarian aid that they're receiving, they're taking it from the people of Gaza for themselves. We know that the Palestinian national movement that is representing the national aspirations of the Palestinian people does not support Hamas. So Palestinians, rank and file Palestinians in Gaza may be supportive of Hamas, which I suspect they are, but the Palestinian national movement is not supportive of Hamas. You hear that? The Arab world is silent. The Arab world is silent. They're not supporting Hamas. The only Muslim country that is openly and vocally supporting Hamas is Turkey, even more than Iran on a declarative level. And we know that Iran is supporting Hamas, technically, militarily, financially, and so on. Qatar is supporting Hamas, but it's positioned itself as a neutral, honest broker. And then, of course, you have Russia. And we'll talk about that axis, why that axis even exists, and what's the purpose of the Russian, Iranian, Qatari axis here, using proxies such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen, and possibly other organizations in the near future. So we have to understand that is one piece of that perfect storm. You had Hamas attacking Israel. The 70% are completely exposed to the toxic messages of the 10%. And the 10% are talking about things that make sense to them. How could that be? Well, here comes in technology. Since 2007 will be remembered in the history of the evolution of humanity as a dramatic year, because two things happened in 2007. The first was the introduction of the smartphone. The smartphone was the first time in history where we were given the opportunity basically to have access in our pocket, access to the world, anything and everything. And then, of course, it was also the introduction of the social networks of Facebook. Now, what happened as a result of the introduction of both things was the beginning, the aggressive beginning of what we call information overload. What is information overload? Is the most prominent feature of today's technology. See, the human brain was never designed to handle so many stimulations simultaneously. It was designed to allow us to survive in nature, and therefore we can handle 3 or 4 stimulations the most. So when people talk about multitasking is a myth. It doesn't really exist. If you try to do more than two or three things simultaneously, what will happen is that the level of performance will go down. But the human brain is not designed, was never designed to handle hundreds of digital signals and stimulations simultaneously. So what happens to the human brain? This was tested scientifically. So the attention span obviously goes down, and we can see that over the years, how the attention span goes down. But more than that, the human brain, because it's incapable of making sense of all those stimulations, the level of anxiety goes up, and you see that in the number of suicides. Look at the old charts in Australia and Canada and South Africa and the United States and England. Since 2007, sharp rise in the number of suicides, especially among young girls. Sharp rise in the consumption of anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication. Sharp rise in the number of people that turned to receive mental help. And that's one aspect of it, the rise of anxiety. And of course, when we're anxious, we also tend to make mistakes. So we see many things that are happening in society that don't make any sense. parents leaving their babies in the cars for hours, and then they come back and the baby is dead because of the heat. It happens all over the world. This is something that did not happen so frequently before 2007. And it's happening not because the parents are evil, but because their brain is functioning on a different level because of information overload. But here comes the impact that is relevant to our conversation. When we are bombarded with hundreds of digital stimulations every day, and we'll talk about the remedy for it, there's a remedy for it. We become creatures that crave simplicity in the face of growing complexity. That's the main feature of our time. That's why you see the rise of political populism throughout the Western world, which is more susceptible to this than the peoples that live under authoritarian regimes. So what you're seeing is people that are looking for simple solutions simply because they cannot handle the complexity, and they couldn't possibly handle the complexity because there's too much information. I'll give you many examples. But the best example is Brexit. Well, it doesn't matter whether you support Brexit or you're against Brexit. There's no debate that the word Brexit itself, the idea that Brexit represents, is very, very simple solution to a highly complex problem. The relationship between England and Europe is highly complex. We're talking about hundreds of different agreements that were signed. And the European Union, as you all know, is a huge bureaucracy. And so to come up with the idea that let's put an end to it, let's just exit Europe, is such a simple idea, so compelling, and a lot of people went for it. Today, you will not find one serious economist in England that will tell you that Brexit was a good idea. One, you will not find. President Trump offering a very simple solution to the problem of Mexico. Now, United States relations with Mexico, highly complex. Believe me, I spent time in Southern California to realize that. I spent years in Southern California. Why is it so highly complex? Because not all Mexicans are interested in migrating to America permanently. In fact, most of them are interested in working in the fields in Southern California, Southern Arizona, and Texas, then coming back. These are seasonal migrants. In fact, many of them have much better life in Mexico than they have as immigrants in America, working in a back room of a restaurant in South LA. Yet President Trump came up with this very compelling idea. Let's build a wall. Really, that's the solution? A wall? Yeah. And it's compelling to people who have no idea how complex the situation is on the ground. Have no idea how complex the situation is on the ground. Who's going to take all those jobs as busboys in restaurants in LA and Texas and Arizona? Who's going to work in all those car wash places? Who's going to replace the Mexicans that are doing all those odd jobs, construction workers? So if you build a wall, you're creating a massive problem for your own societies. But hey, we live in the age of information overload. Don't confuse me with details. Don't confuse me with complexities. I want simple solutions. For example, free Palestine. That's easy. Let's free Palestine. Let's understand the conflict in the Middle East as an issue of European colonialism. Here's the story, very simple for people to understand. And in many ways, we, the Israelis and our Jewish brothers and sisters, we were pushing that story on not realizing the damage. Here's the story. The Europeans did something horrible to the Jews. They killed 6 million of them. Now the world felt the guilt after killing the Jews, and they decided to give those European Jews, they're the remaining people that survived the Holocaust, give them a piece of land that did not belong to them, that belonged to the poor Palestinians. So, according to this narrative, which is the prevailing narrative today in the Western world, the poor indigenous Palestinians are de facto the victims of the Holocaust. You don't believe me? What was President Barack Obama's first action in the Middle East as a president? He came to Cairo in 2009 to give a speech. It was a very important speech in which he spoke to the world of Islam, and he tried to fix the mistakes of his predecessor, whose big mistake was not attacking Iran after 9/11. Attacking Iraq was the wrong thing. Just imagine, use your imagination, what would have happened if George W. Bush had attacked Iran, which served as the inspiration for Al-Qaeda, and not Iraq, who had very little to do with Al-Qaeda. But he gave that speech. Now, when you go back and you listen to that speech, it's a very important speech by itself. Problem is that instead of going from Cairo, where he addressed the Egyptian legislator, as he should have done, he had to go to Jerusalem to address the Israeli Knesset and give a similar speech about his vision for the peace process. What did he do? He did not go to Jerusalem. Do you know where he went? He went to Buchenwald. He went to Buchenwald to lay a wreath with Angela Merkel and Elie Wiesel by his side. And he was sending the world indirectly a message that this is the narrative. To you, the Palestinians and the Muslims and the Arabs, I extend my hand in peace, and I balance that by acknowledging the role of the Holocaust. In other words, there were no decades and decades and decades of nation building before the Holocaust. He forgot or never knew about people that envisioned Jewish independence and statehood and nationalism decades before Theodor Herzl. Decades before Theodor Herzl. We're talking about my family came here in 1870. That doesn't count. Only the Holocaust. It was our fault. Because we constantly spoke about that. And that became the justification.
But aren't we doing the same thing now? We're calling 7th of October our Holocaust. It's modern Israel's Holocaust.
Yeah, well, today is different because when we say the Holocaust, we're referring to the fact that Hamas allowed themselves to do things that even the Nazis did not do. The Nazis were trying to hide their crimes. Like, we don't have footage of Jews dying in the gas chambers. But Hamas' brutality was so shocking, was so pre-civilizational that Hamas was allowing itself to document it and to show the world that how happy they are about doing this. They did it so enthusiastically. And so they not only recorded themselves doing it enthusiastically, they also shared the footage with the rest of the world. I myself...
And yet, ironically, so much of the rest of the world doesn't accept that footage as real. There's so much denial. And it would appear, based on the public demonstrations around the world, what's happening on the university campuses, especially what's happening on social media and the mainstream media, plenty of people might say that Hamas has actually well outdone Israel on the PR front. They've certainly been at it for much longer and go way back. What's the origins of BDS? What's its intention? And so you've got this connection, this nexus between anti-Israel and anti-Semitism and Hamas seems to be winning that PR battle.
Yeah.
So
So let me explain. It's not that they're winning the PR battle. Actually, they have pretty bad PR. They are so in marketing, there is this thing called positioning. Positioning refers to the position you are in as opposed to your competitors. So Israel's positioning, for example, from 1948 or from 1945. And 1945 was an important year because also of the Arab economic boycott, which is very important for us to understand the roots of this hatred towards Israel, anti-Semitic roots. So from 1945 until 1973, clearly Israel occupied the position of the victim in the eyes of the world. Israel was the underdog, a small country that barely survived in 48, that was threatened and attacked and won in 67, and then again was existentially threatened in 73 and succeeded. So from 45 to 73, that's the era where Israel was in the positioning of the underdog. Then 1982 comes. Israel, for the first time, is launching a war against Lebanon, against Fatah in Lebanon. I was part of that war, 1982. That's when, this Menachem Begin, that's when Israel's positioning is beginning to change. From the regional David to the regional Goliath. Menachem Begin didn't understand what he was doing. He didn't understand the meaning of what is the meaning of changing the positioning of Israel. Then you had the first Intifada that broke out in December of 1987. So it was in the 1980s under Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon that Israel's positioning changed dramatically within less than 10 years from clearly being the David of the region to becoming the Goliath of the region. Now, I'm not saying they should not have invaded Lebanon. All I'm saying is, from a marketing point of view, that's where the seeds were planted. Now, humans are programmed to identify with the underdog. When you see a little baby, what do? Oh, what a beautiful baby. When you see a little puppy, when you watch a game of two teams you don't even know, all right? And one team is leading by 50 points. You don't know the teams. You're in the airport. You're waiting for a flight. And you just watch this you catch that game on the TV screen. It happens to me all the time. When I see a college game and one team is leading by 50 points, my heart immediately goes to support the other team. I want to see an upset. I support the underdog. There's a human reaction. So that's what you're seeing. It's not that the Hamas has great PR. They don't have any PR. They're disastrous. What are you talking about? They went on television saying that the massacre didn't happen themselves, whereas their own people were documenting it. You know, I didn't see the movie that was produced by the IDF of the atrocities. I went straight to the Hamas account when at the time it was still available, where they uploaded all the files themselves. I spent 2.5 hours watching the atrocities that they themselves uploaded. This was on October 8th and October 9th. And I remember my son was sitting right here in this room when watching it. My son, before he went to Gaza, my youngest son was upset with me. He said, "Dad, don't watch that. Don't watch this stuff. That's exactly what they want you to do. Don't watch it." And I must say, he was right. I had to watch it because I knew that I would have to talk about it. But my son was right. I don't recommend watching it. And we can talk about that. So to go back to your question, David, this is not about PR. It's about positioning. And Israel is in a lousy position because it's being perceived as the side that has the might, the military might, the economic strength. We have the numbers. We're 10 million people. And the Palestinians are being clearly viewed by the world as the underdog. That's where Free Palestine comes from. It's a simple solution to a very complex problem. And of course, people set aside the fact that the Palestinians' rejection rejected every compromise that was presented to them from 1937, 1947, 2000, 2005, the pull out of Gaza, 2008. Of course, the Khartoum summit in 1967, when the Arabs said no. Now, let's go back to the Arab League economic boycott. So when people talk about BDS, it really reflects lack of understanding of history. The idea to boycott Israel did not emerge now. It starts in 1945 when the Jewish people were at the lowest point in their history. There were less than 500,000 Jews right here, including my parents, including my grandparents. And the Arab League, 23 Arab countries, is announcing out of Damascus the Arab economic boycott. They enacted the Arab economic boycott, which is a global attempt to suffocate the tiny economy that there was here in 1945, that we had here in 1945. We have to remember, in 1945, we had a little bit of agriculture, a tiny bit of industry, a couple of universities, and that's it. There was no economy. There was nothing to suffocate, basically. Yet, they wanted to destroy us. And guess what? The vast majority of the world complied explicitly in the case of the Arabs and some Muslim countries, but implicitly in the case of the rest of the world, including the United States. We did not have any American products in Israel until the 1980s, the 1990s, with the two exceptions were Coca-Cola and TWA. And those were the exceptions because they had Jewish board members. In the case of TWA, I actually know the story because it was my wife's grandfather who was on the board of TWA. His name was Lou Boyer. And he pushed for TWA doing business in Israel. He was a Zionist. But we didn't have American brands in Israel. No cars, no appliances, nothing. No American brands in Israel. No hotel chains. So which countries were selling products to the Israelis at that time? Until 1967, clearly was the French people that were selling products. The cars in Israel were French. Everything was French in Israel. We consumed French culture. Many people don't know that. The Soviets, of course, participated in the boycott against Israel. So when people talk about BDS, they should know some history. They should learn some history. This is a joke. The real boycott was 1945, when the world actually gave hand to the effort to suffocate Israel's tiny economy and failed. And failed. And the reason the world failed is the same reason the world will fail now. And this is not even the world now. At that time, we didn't have the support of any nations. Today, we have an unprecedented diplomatic umbrella that includes the United States, but also India. A lot of people tend to undermine or underestimate the importance of the support of India. India will emerge, according to the, if I understand correctly, the geopolitical strategy of the Americans. The Americans are planning on building India as a counterbalancing act to China. And they will succeed because the Indians have assets. Tremendous assets. Among them is a sufficient degree of human creativity to outperform the Chinese if they do it right within 20, 25 years. They can outperform the Chinese easily if handled correctly. And so I think the American strategy is correct. But India is hugely supportive of Israel. Our research shows that the level of support for Israel in India is the highest in the world of any other country, the highest in the world. I'm talking about the Indian people. And that's pretty incredible. So back to your question, David, it's not necessarily a question of public relations. It's a question of positioning. It's true that Israel could do better if it will remove from the screen representative of the Israel Defense Forces wearing uniform. This is something that the Israelis see as a natural thing. It's not being viewed naturally. by people all over the world. People wearing uniform usually are scary to other people. We don't see enough Israeli women on the screen. So there are a lot of things that we can do PR-wise to improve our position. First thing is get rid of the uniform and put women on the screen, which we don't do. Like we haven't learned a thing in 75 years of conflict. And avoid references to cataclysmic and existential things, because the year is not 1948. In 1948, Israel was helpless. Today, Israel is a superpower. So people know that. And when you say, I'm fighting for my existence, it's really not a reliable statement. And Mr. Netanyahu keeps on saying it. It's not reliable because people don't believe you because they know the facts. And so again, these are all PR disasters. But essentially, the problem that we're facing is not PR. The problem that we're facing is that we lost the position of the underdog, and the world likes to identify with the underdog. And now
So where do
with
we go to from here? What's the next step to get
so we have to
basically the world love us?
So we have to first of all, the world does love us. The vast majority of people in the world support Israel, especially in the Western world. We see that in every public opinion survey. Even among the Democrats in America, you see a sharp rise. According to Pew, this is a study that was published on December 8th, and I urge all of our friends in Australia to go online and look at the results. Even among Democrats, there's a sharp rise in the level of support for what Israel is doing in Gaza. This is from December 8th. So we're not alone. The world supports us. There's a small minority on the left, very vocal, that's making a lot of noise. And they are the one who are spewing those toxic messages about Israel performing genocide and Israel apartheid and so on and so forth. We all know that these are messages that make no sense. Now, how did they end up there?
Even though our allies and our supporters are increasingly making more noise about the level of civilian casualties or perceived civilian casualties in Gaza. And
so there are two ways to deal with it, as I said before. The first is and you have to do it in Australia, because you have to understand there's a new, because of information overload, because of this craving for simplicity, these people adopted a binary view of the world, right? So the world is divided between good and evil, oppressed and oppressors, victims and victimizers. And if you're not with me, you're against me, by definition. So there's no in between, there's no nuance, there's no complexity. And evil must be eradicated. So this, especially the younger people, are vindictive, vengeful, violent. And it started in 2012, 2013, when students throughout the United States started demanding the dismissal of professors they disagreed with what they said in class. And so some researchers, in particular Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, started looking at it and said, well, what's going on here? Well, we've never seen this before. Students demanding the dismissal. This is a violent act. Students were attacking physically professors for a misunderstood email. The professor wrote an email that was misinterpreted, and they physically attacked him. This happened in Evergreen College in Washington State. And they said, what's going on here? And so they started researching it, and then they published an article and then a book titled The Coddling of the American Mind, how good intentions set the generation for failure. And indeed, these kids that you see chanting from the river to the sea, they're representative of that generation. They are chanting something that expresses their failure to deal with nuance and their binary view of reality. So in regular times, David, I would say we need to invest in the 70%. That's the brand Israel approach. Let's give the 70% the immune system to deal with the toxic messages. But unfortunately, we didn't do that. this is the time to punish the 10%. What does it mean to punish them? It's okay to say, I have criticism of the Israeli government. I support the two-state solution. Okay. I support Palestinian nationalism. There are many Israelis that do that. Many Israelis support the two-state solution. Many Israelis support Palestinian national aspirations. It's not okay to say from the river to the sea because you're saying, let's eliminate Israel. There are over 200 countries in the world. No country was ever asked to cancel itself. What you're seeing now is Israel as a victim of cancel culture. They want to cancel Israel the same way they want to cancel Gone with the Wind, the same way they want to cancel other things. And so the solution, and you have to understand it because it affects your future as Australian Jews. The solution is to punish the people spewing those toxic messages. And if you have people in Australia that tear down the posters of the hostages, you need to record them, find out who they are, and pursue them. We call it name, shame, and pursue. What does it mean to pursue? It means you need to inform their employers that that's what they did, that that's what they stood for, that they supported a genocidal, deadly organization, a jihadist, Islamist organization that wants to destroy the West, that is seeing all of us as infidels. And this is what this woman did, a nurse in a hospital in New Jersey. She was tearing down a poster of a 9-month-old baby held in captivity. Are you aware of the fact that this lady is your employee? And you would be 100% protected by law for doing that. And not only that, you need to create a database of all the Australians that participated in those demonstrations and chase them for the rest of their lives. There was a professor at Cornell in New York that the day of the attack, this is before Israeli military response, stood in front of his students with a megaphone, and he was yelling, I'm exhilarated this morning, he said to his students. I'm energized by what I saw. In his binary mind, his team just scored, and he's happy. For him, it's like a game. And so I looked up this professor. Who is he, the spokesperson of the oppressed? Who is this guy? Where is it coming from? Because, you could think maybe his parents were refugees from the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. No, he was raised by a couple of professors from the Bay Area, from Stanford. That privileged American professor represents the oppressed in their twisted binary view of the world. And me, look at me, I'm white privilege in his eyes. Look at me, I'm white privilege, and I'm the oppressor. Me, that my grandparents came from Yemen barefoot in 1912. They are the colonizers in his eyes. My mother that was cleaning houses for an entire life. My grandfather that was cleaning the streets of Tel Aviv for the sanitation department, was a garbage man, as we used to call it. They are the colonizers. And that little prick from Stanford is the oppressed. So I told my friends in America, take this guy whose name is Russell Rickford. Remember that name, Russell Rickford. And by the way, his apology was even worse than what he said. His apology was, I'm sorry that I caused pain. So even his apology is narcissistic. It's about him. He caused pain. He's like an emperor. He's like Attila the Hun. He has so much power to cause pain. No, my friend, it's not about the pain that you caused. It's about the fact that you lack the moral clarity to be an educator. If you support an organization that massacred babies, he didn't say in his apology, I was wrong in my position. He didn't say that. So what needs to be done with Russell Rickford? I'll tell you what needs to be done with Russell Rickford. It's the duty of the American Jewish community to pursue him until the rest of his life and make sure that he never, ever gets a job anywhere, not even for Starbucks. Not that there's anything wrong with Starbucks. Now, why is it that important to pursue him? Because that will serve as a deterrent. This generation, which is a product of overprotective parenting, among other things, as Jonathan Haidt and Greg Luciano are teaching us, has no resilience. Bill Ackman, a big hedge fund guy from New York, issued a statement after 34 student organizations were supporting Hamas at Harvard. The day of the attack, again, this is before any Israeli military response. He said, I want to know the names of the people that signed the petitions because I want to make sure that I will never hire them. And I want to make sure that none of my colleagues will ever hire them. And guess what was the response? These kids have no resilience. They were not brought up with the ability to face challenges and solve problems. Hundreds of them retracted immediately. But the excuses were lame. Some of them said, law student that said, I did not read the statement before I signed it. They posted on their social media, afraid that they will be canceled as a result of their attempt to cancel Israel. So I'm just giving this to you as an example. That's what you need to do. And if you will not do it, the situation will only get worse. They'll try to push you back into the enclaves of 100 years ago. That's what they're trying to do.
Unfortunately, I mean, we could go on for a long, long time. I'm going to ask you an impossible question to answer, but hope that you can do it. Given that you have intimate knowledge of many universities around the world, and obviously Tel Aviv University, where you teach and you started your studies at the university, the question that I've got is, what's unique about the university and how does that play a role in the rebuilding of Israel? Because the focus is now starting to move and shift a little bit to what happens when. I think in the last 8 weeks, we've moved a little bit away from will we survive and how will we survive to now, okay, what are we going to do to rebuild when that time comes, even if we don't know when it is? So I'm wondering if
Excellent,
you have,
yeah, excellent question. So first of all, we need to look at the time frame. This is going to be it's going to take years. It took Israel 22 years to do away with the people that carried out the Munich massacre in 1972. It's going to take years and years and years. And remember, Israel is also committed to take out Hezbollah in the north, because if there's one thing that we learned from 10/7 is that we cannot live like this. We cannot live when you have a genocidal Islamist jihadist organization with military capabilities along your borders. You have to take them out. So now we're taking out Hamas, but we at one point will have to take out Hezbollah, unprovoked. One day you'll wake up and you'll see a big headline in the paper, Israel attacked Hezbollah. But in order for that to happen, Israel needs to build a diplomatic umbrella. I'm not sure this government is capable of doing it, the Israeli government. So this may have to wait for a future government and a future leadership, because the Israelis really don't trust the current leadership. So this is the time frame. So we're talking about a multi-year effort. It took the Americans, the New Yorkers, 15 years to rebuild Lower Manhattan. And I suspect that it will take us a generation to rebuild the Israeli South, but more importantly, to rebuild the trust of the Israelis in their leadership, in their army. Actually, the Israelis trust the army more than they trust their political leadership. So these are the tasks. And it's important to rebuild the trust of Israelis in their political leadership, because without that, you cannot run the system. There has to be a minimal level of trust. So the University of Tel Aviv, as the largest on-campus university, also sent the largest number of students to serve in the army. One of them is my son. I think we're about 5,500 students serving in the army right now, which is a huge number. Of course, we had many students that were killed, many students that participated in that peace festival. We have people affiliated with the university that lost their children. One of my colleagues lost his son in the war. And so the university will continue to play an important role. Now, what role would that be? We know that after every major military challenge that Israel faced, we also experienced years later a very long period of prosperity. Why did that happen? Because Israel has a built-in advantage which other countries in our regions do not have. We are a major producer of knowledge, knowledge that matters, knowledge that allows the progression of humankind. And so, as long as Tel Aviv University will continue to excel, as long as Tel Aviv University will continue to produce knowledge that matters, as long as Tel Aviv University will increase that relevance element. Remember, we spoke about differentiation, knowledge, esteem, and relevance. Universities have a big role in creating that relevance because they are producing medical breakthroughs, they're producing technological breakthroughs, insights in other fields. And these are all elements that enhance and boost the immune system of the Israeli society. So this is really the role of Tel Aviv, to continue to be the excellent institution it is today, to lead the way. And the more we will invest in Tel Aviv University in research, the more we will help the university to perform its duties, the easier it will become for Israel as a nation to recover from this horrible crisis and to reach new heights. After every time this happened, we went low, but then we climbed up to a much higher point than before. That's what's going to happen. It's going to take a couple of years, but it will happen. And Tel Aviv University, again, being the largest and one of the most excellent universities in the world, has a very big role in this process. And so I hear many people that want to disengage, they're upset with Netanyahu, they're upset with the Israeli government. I said to them, no. Put aside what you feel about Mr. Netanyahu. It's irrelevant. It's about the Israeli people. And this is the time to engage, not disengage, more forcefully, more enthusiastically, knowing that this time you're really going to make a difference. And you're going to make a difference in a very big way. Because again, Tel Aviv University has a central role in the recovery process. I hope I answered your question, David.
Thank you. That you did indeed. Look, I think you'll agree. We could probably keep talking for another hour. There's so much more that we'd love to cover. Perhaps we might invite you back to speak with us again. But I want to thank you so very, very much for spending the time with us today and sharing your thoughts. It's been illuminating. It's been thought-provoking. And for those of you listening in online, either live or to the recording, if you'd like to follow Ido, you'll find him predominantly on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X, which for the old people like me is Twitter. As Ido said, Tel Aviv University has been significantly impacted by the war. Close to 6,000 students, faculty, and staff were called for reserve duty, and the academic year is yet to commence later this month. In face of the ongoing conflict, the university rallied its global community to provide extensive support to the student reservists, the faculty, evacuee families, and other people adversely affected, other communities right throughout Israel. And the Tau Emergency Fund that was created, and we have been raising funds for, has assisted and will continue to assist people who are enduring trauma and hardship. We could have a whole conversation about the trauma that's the society is facing, but with the goal of enabling them to prevail and thrive in the weeks, months, and years to come. And as Israel faces its deepest crisis in decades, well, since 48 at least, the broad support of our true friends serves as a ray of light and bolsters our resilience as both a nation and as a global people. Now, if you have already contributed to the emergency fund, please accept our deepest gratitude and our friendship for your support. And if you haven't yet, please consider doing so as we close out the calendar year. On the last night of Hanukkah, it would be a wonderful present for someone in need. And if you want to, just go to the AFTAL website. It's www.aftau.asn.au, or contact the office. We will, of course, keep you appraised of forthcoming webinars. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today and to wish you goodbye.